Yes. Well, first of all, a warm welcome to everybody joining this conference, and more specifically this event that we are hosting right now. So we are very happy to see that there are over 80 people registered for this session from all over the world. So I'm very happy to see that it's a topic that interests a lot of people. Wouter, can you go to the next slide, please? My name is Erica van Doorn, and I'm the director of Symphony. And in this session, we have a few contributors to the discussion. Frank Hopstake, you can see her here in the agenda, Helle Lund from India, and Mary also from India, and Dorothy from the OECD. So if you have any questions whatsoever, feel free to use the chat box, and we try to address as many questions as possible. First of all, I will say a few lines about Symphony. Wouter, can you go to the next slide, please? Yes. Symphony is a not-for-profit organization and one of the largest textile collection companies in the Netherlands. Our goal is to contribute to a circular textile value chain. Now, in order to do that, we collect textiles in the Netherlands, approximately 20 million kilograms every year. And we sort those categories, we sort the textiles by categories. So obviously the most sustainable is to prolong the lifespan of a piece of garment. So most of the garments, 70% actually, is used for reuse. So either in the Netherlands or elsewhere in Europe or outside Europe, based on the qualities that are sorted. Now there's about 30% which is not wearable textiles anymore. And this is partly sold to facilities in India for recycling. Not directly from Symphony, but through our partners in the value chain. And like I said, Symphony's goal is to contribute to a circular textile chain. And we can only claim that we are on the right track if we know how and where all the textiles is going. So we have done studies to see where the textiles in the value chain that we collected end up. So that is some of the research we have done before. And I'm sure that Frank will say a little bit more about it later on. And today we are digging into the question of due diligence. How can we, as a collection and sorting company, take our responsibility for the social conditions further down the value chain? And also, how can we set up a system that we can track the non-wearable textiles in the products they end up. So, for instance, today, if you buy a piece of garment and there's inside a label saying it's partly recycled content, what is the proof of that? How can you be sure that indeed the content of the material is recycled, and where it is recycled, and under what conditions it's recycled? These are difficult topics that we as a company are trying to address and study, and we are very glad to share some of our insights with you, and hopefully also get some valuable feedback for us to continue our work in this field. Can you go to the next slide, please? And this is for me the point to hand over to Frank.
Yes, thank you, Erika. My name is Frank Hopstaken. I'm a director of Effect, and we assisted Symphony since 2017, especially in this project, in the starting up of this project. And therefore, in 2014-15, we worked for the ministry, the Dutch ministry, to get a good sight of the mass balance of used textiles in the Netherlands. And that's how we got into contact with Symphony, and they asked us to help them to get a more precise idea about all the routing of their textiles, of their used textiles. So we did this project in India, reported in 2019 already about more or less the social and sustainable supply chain, and this assessment led to the next questions. Erika already introduced. We entered into the next steps, and the next steps are that we want to have a real chain of custody up to the sorting and recycling point in Panipat, which is an industry where we have a partner in the chain who is working together also in this project. What we wanted to do is get a better investigation how to improve the social conditions there and prevent especially child labor. And Helen will tell more about child labor, and she will also tell that we want to have a schooling system in place for the children there, especially the children from the textile industry. So we worked together last 2 years with the textile industry in India to get this system going on. At the end, the ultimate aim is a production of yarn with the circle yarn label, and this yarn label has to include all things, so the chain of custody, but also a label for the social conditions. And it has to have up to 75% of post-consumer recycled content. So that's all included in this label. As Erika told, that we want to prove in the garments that have to be produced afterwards, after producing this yarn. Below you see some pictures of our partner at the end of the supply chain in India. So they do the sorting of the textiles, the after sorting, they do the spinning, and they now produce more or less not the garments, but they produce household linens and blankets for the market, but all of at least ultimately up to 90-95% of PCR at the moment. They are ISO and GRS certified at the moment. So that's for an introduction. Wouter, next slide, please. Now what we want to do is monitor the improvements in social conditions, and we looked at how could we be assisted. We went to looking at all the guidelines and standards, and we ended up at SA 8000, so for social accountability, as a first reference. You see here in this picture, you see the 9 criteria of the SA 8000 standard, also in icons. And I'm not going to explain all these 9, but probably you are well aware. If you're in this field, you're well aware of these criteria that you have to meet if you want to comply to this standard. So ending up, we want to produce this PCR labeled content in yarns for making new garments. That's the goal for the next years. And we end up with 4 questions. Which global monitoring system is suitable for this chain? How can we inform the consumers properly on the social conditions? How to guarantee a level playing field? And that's also an important question. So are we not overachieving in these conditions? So because it's a large challenge, we will come to that later on. And especially, that's the question also for the discussion afterwards. Can SA 8000 certification scheme be useful to fulfill OECD due diligence guidelines? Is it comparable, or is it in practice not comparable? And what to choose? What would be the best option for our project? So probably you can come into the discussion afterwards and help us with this puzzle. Next slide, please. To get you some more idea, what we did, we made a comparison of the criteria between the standards. On the left-hand side, you see SAA 1000 and the 9 criteria we already showed in the former slide. And on the right-hand side, you see OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises. This is the 2011 version, and you see that 6 of the 9 topics are also covered in the guidelines for multinational enterprises. Probably others are also a little bit, but explicitly we found 6. In the guidance that was made for the due diligence in the garment sector, so that was in 2017 produced, we see in this guidance, we see all the 9 topics in several sections. And they are also described in a more or less similar way. So what we see here is say more a comparison, and the SAA 1000 criteria fit to OECD guidelines and partly cover all these topics that are in there and all the criteria. OECD guidelines, however, are non-binding. They are consistent with standards, but they are not binding for the people and the industry that is applying to it. And SAA 1000 is a real certification scheme, so you have to meet up with all the standards and to get social accountability. So it is a real accountability scheme. OECD uses especially a transparent progress reporting, so you can report on all the criteria and all the topics, how far you are in the process. But for us is the question if this leads to a real labeling and if this is also fitting in the label we want to produce in our new garments. So this is first introduction. I will come later on with you as a moderator for the discussion. And now I give over to Helle from Humana, we work together, and she can explain more about the situation in India.
Which my organization, Humana People to People India, made from December 2020 to February 21. And we made the survey among 26 factories in Panipat, working with clothes meant for recycling. And Panipat is a city in the northern part of India, approximately 3 hours drive from north of New Delhi. And it is like a hotspot in India for clothes recycling. There are more than 200 factories dealing with clothes recycling, some smaller, some bigger. And we made the survey with 26 factories, and one of them is a very big factory, and the 25 others, they are suppliers to that factory, either second or third supplier. And we got a letter sent from all those factories. We surveyed 518 workers, which we were talking to one by one when visiting the factories. And we gave questions to them on different topics related to the SA 8000. We also surveyed their children. It was a little bit hard to find them, but we managed to go to their home settings and survey and talk to all the children. In total, 1,332 children. Out of those 1,061, they were in the age where they should actually have gone to school. But we found that 222 children, they were out of school, and that is actually 21% of the children that were found out of school. We also asked questions about child labor, And we found that an honest reply came from 48 children and their parents and said, yes, we or our children, we are working. And we know for sure that other children, they might also, out of the 222 children, might be working part-time, but 48 children admitted they were working, and it is 4.5% of the children. We found that very few of the factories, they actually knew about, had general awareness about corporate social responsibility and about standards. Only one of the factories were found to have some systems in place. When it came to contracts, then approximately 25% of the workers, they have a contract because they are more permanent workers, means they are working with in the offices or with good machinery that needs skilled workers, and they have a contract. But 75% of the workers, they are daily wage workers, and they are not having any contract. Most of them, they are actually hired through contractors. When it comes to health and safety conditions, then if you ask the factory owners and the managers, they will say it is good to average. The reality is it is, I would say, more average or below average. Wages, the 25% that have contracts, they are definitely having the minimum wage, and they are also having, most of them, what is called the living wage. However, the 75% that are daily wage workers, they are either paid the minimum wage or most likely they are paid under the minimum wage. So that is the situation, and below you can see a few pictures from our survey that we conducted. Can we have the next slide, please? Here are some of the other observations during our survey. First of all, most of the daily wage workers, they are migrant workers that are coming from other states than Haryana, where Panipat is located. They are coming from Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, West Bengal. They are from many different places in India where there are very poor living conditions, and they are therefore coming to Panipat to seek a job. 70% of those, they are daily wage workers, as I said before, without any contract. And 60% of them, they are illiterate. This maybe also tells us why they are not particularly interested, or they are not so conscious about sending their children to school, because their own knowledge about education is very low. When it comes to the different facilities in the factories, then we found that in the bigger factories, there were a lot of different things in place, but in the smaller factories, very, very few things were in place, such as no area for lunch break, not inside, not outside. The workers, they have to sit on a pile of clothes to eat their lunch or take a cup of tea. And some of the women that are bringing younger children to the factories, they are lying around sleeping or playing, and there's no facility to take care of those children. And also in very few places there is a good ventilation. And when it comes to checking the documents, then there's not very good checking of the documents. It is very limited. And it's, of course, also because many of the factories, they do not have the data of the workers because they are sent by a contractor to the factory to work for a set period of time. And it is in these settings where we have been working with Symphony and Effect to give bridge education to those children that are not going to school, to make sure that they can get a different life and opportunity to get a different life from their parents. Yeah, that was it from my side, and you're welcome to ask questions after the session. Thank you. Next slide, please. I think the next slide, it will be you, Mary.
Yes. Thank you so much for your observations in the factory survey. I mean, the social compliance, naturally, it is a very important to go business and human rights hand in hand together. That is a way we can ensure the workers' standard. The child labor and forced labor in the supply chain, and continuously monitoring working hours, wages, overtime, workplace safety through document verifications, and also equally important, interaction with workers. So while doing interacting with workers, we have to involve the local trade unions and the labor right activists, so that the local situation is known to them. And then credibility of a certification scheme and agency, it is very frequently they have to do different kind of methodology. Each and every time they have to follow it up to really with a sense of bringing up the whatever the challenges in the workplaces related to all the social compliance like child labor, forced labor, working hours, wages, and overtime at workplaces. And then whenever it comes popping up, it has to be dealt with a systematic manner. So the system has to be placed very strongly in any of the concern. The system have to be continuously monitored. Next slide. Stakeholder interaction is very, very important. So while doing all the business related stakeholders, we have to map it, and then all the stakeholders, they have to be involved in ensuring the social compliance in that particular factory. Interaction with top management within the factory, we have to have a sufficient and with regular intervals interaction with the top managers, owners about the sustainable trading, and attitude and expertise of middle managers and related consultancies, where consultant is very important. So when you're measuring the attitude of the middle managers, those who are the only directly connecting with the people, the expertise and attitude is not towards the labor rights, then we have to vigilance about their attitude and giving an opportunity for them to work on it. Multi-stakeholder process of addressing the social conditions in the workplaces, very important. These are, within the factory premises, the top level to workers. Outside of the premises, trade unions, who are the men for organizing the workers, and then certificate agencies if the particular factory is engaging them, and the brands, one who is sourcing from the factories. Apart from this, also some other stakeholder can be there, the local defeated or elected political persons, and the government agencies. Government agencies, the labor department of that particular area also must be included in this multi-stakeholder process to move or to ensure the social compliance are taking properly placed in the factory, and also it is moving in a sustainable way. With this, I stop here. If anyone wants to discuss about this, most welcome after the entire slides completes.
Mary,
Yeah.
thank you very much. I take the liberty to ask a question for clarification.
Yes,
because I know you have a lot of expertise in dealing with business and human rights, and also on the part of the supply chain where the garments are made, right? The production part of the supply chain. And here we talk about a different part of the supply chain, where it's much harder to have single brands take their responsibility for how their clothes are being recycled, right? So you talk about the importance of labor rights activists and also labor rights activists and trade unions. In your experience, are there labor rights activist organizations and also trade unions in Panipat, in the recycling industry?
This questions I suppose to, because since Panipat area, the working the previous person explaining that, she may be the right person to say that are they identified any trade unions around that Panipat area.
Do you see a difference, Mary? Mary, do you see a difference between the different parts of the supply chain and how social conditions are treated, or how it's being monitored or assessed?
Yes, I mean it is naturally it is different, right? Because in wherever the brand's direct intervention is there, they will look into it in certain, I won't say the 100% perfect is there, but still there is a monitoring system will be there. But when we are completing this, there is no brand's responsibility, or brands are not involving directly in this course of producing materials and all these things. In such a circumstances, we have to, the production people, we have to depend on one trade unions or any certification bodies along with the local government. Government system always will be there, every part of India. So we have to utilize all those systems to standardize the social conditions of the workers.
Thank you.
Thank you. Probably we can continue with you, Dorothy.
Yeah, sure. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for inviting me to come and speak on this really important session. I also just wanted to really commend Symphony for even having this discussion, and I think it's perhaps not very common in the recycling sector, and so it's great that you're opening these doors, and particularly to see what are the social and environmental risks in this important supply chain or circular supply chain, and how to address those, given, as Mary just very well articulated, we don't really have the same actors that are perhaps taking responsibility that normally come under the pressures, talking about brands and the types of pressures from investors, from consumers, that might bring light to this. So I just wanted to talk about a few different things. Firstly, I wanted to perhaps talk and explore a bit why the recycling sector is kind of different, and yet why it's not different. Secondly, that the due diligence guidance of the OECD does apply to this part of the sector, and how and who has responsibility. And thirdly, perhaps to get just into a bit of detail through the OECD due diligence steps as to what that actually means for these actors in doing due diligence. And then I know there's going to be some good discussion about standards as well following, so I'll probably leave that for the Q&A. So firstly, it's a very interesting part of the supply chain. As we all know, I'm by no means an expert in it, and I know there are other experts on the call, so we can perhaps dig into that a bit more later on. But we're talking about a hidden value chain. We're talking about the materials, if they're post-consumer or even pre-consumer waste, that come out of the first part of the supply chain, the first mainly linear supply chain from extraction, production, consumer, and then post-consumer. And then what happens to it, we don't know. There's very little transparency about this. We're also talking about products of very low value, and I think this is a very important thing to consider when we're talking about this part of the supply chain. We know that products, when recycled, often go down in value when they're recycled. So we're talking here in the report that Arissa and Symphony did a couple of years ago, looking at clothing that ends up in carpets, for example. So that really talking about downward economy. Upcycling is a very nice term, and where it happens, it's very impressive, where you can actually take one product and through the recycling of it, increase the value. But I don't think that's really what we're talking about here. So whether there's potential for that to really to change the situation would be interesting to explore, but it's not really the reality that companies like Symphony are dealing with right now. But we do know that the sector does need to shift towards recycling if the garment sector as a whole is going to really meet its obligations under the Climate Accord from Paris, and perhaps other global commitments to biodiversity, etc. So there could well be opportunity for this sector in coming years economically as well, which is quite exciting, but that also means there would be more scrutiny, I think, which is only a good thing as well. So that aside, how about the OECD guidance in this situation? So of course it applies. The OECD guidance requires companies working within the garment and footwear sector to consider, to understand where there are risks across the supply chain to which they are causing those risks and impacts, contributing to or linked to, which could just mean that the impact happens in the supply chain of that company. And it still denotes an obligation to take some action to prevent, cease, mitigate the harm. Now, when we think about it traditionally in the way the garment guidance came about, that was published in 2017, it's often, think about it from the perspective of the downstream company thinking about the risks in its upstream supply chain. But actually what Symphony is bringing to the table here is this sense of responsibility towards the downstream post-use of materials, and again, that's why I think it's hugely commendable to be having this discussion. So that brings us, well, just to say, of course, so this risk-based approach means that a company has to think across the full supply chain and downstream, where are the most severe risks. They need to identify those and take action, and I'll get into a bit more detail as to what that actually means later. But the other question is, who are we talking about in terms of actors that have this responsibility? And of course, Symphony, as an example of a company, has responsibility because they're collecting materials and they are, sending it on to the next part of the journey, and are part of that kind of onward chain. But I think it's important just to note they're not the only ones. Companies like Symphony are not the only ones with responsibility here. So to break down a little bit, who are we talking about? So we're talking about the brands that originally put the clothing and textiles on the market have a responsibility, which is really important to think about. And there are those that are already taking responsibility here. So brands with take back programs, for example, that are bringing back textiles and thinking what to do with it. Then you also have brands that don't have take back programs, and that doesn't mean they don't have a responsibility. And what's really interesting is that we have, coming policy from governments saying that actually all brands have a responsibility to take back or to take action for the extended, we call it kind of extended producer responsibility. And so this could also change where there could be quite a important uptake from a lot more companies to think about what happens to their clothing post-consumer. And then there's also quite a few charity organizations that use clothing as income generation, which obviously have a role to play. Then you have, so that's kind of the upstream, if you like, of this post-consumer recycling supply chain. Then you have the sorters and recyclers themselves, the spinning mills. And then you have the downstream. So this is the people, the companies buying the outcomes of this recycling process. And these are kind of carpet manufacturers, mattress manufacturers, upcyclers, I'm sure a huge community. But then, as I said earlier on, the kind of issue here is that looking about the economics of it, that we're talking about much lower value products at this point. And I think that does have something to bear. It doesn't change the responsibility, however. So that's who. And I think I also wanted within this section to look a little bit at policy, because I think policy has a lot to play. I mean, we heard already it said that the OECD Garment Guidance and guidance on business and human rights and environmental due diligence is not binding to companies. Well, this is true. It's not binding. However, there's a few, just to kind of clarify a bit more what that means. The 50 governments that have adopted the guidance in the OECD have actually made a commitment to promote, disseminate the guidance and to also bring policy coherence together. So to make sure that they're actually promoting it with all the different policy tools at their disposal. So this creates a really interesting force to actually add teeth to this voluntary guidance. And one way that governments are now doing it, and I think everyone will be aware that just this week the EU put out their draft due diligence law. We have a German supply chain law. So governments are increasingly adopting mandatory due diligence law, which is actually based on the OECD guidance. So even though in and of itself the guidance is not binding, you're going to find that increasingly governments are kind of integrating aspects of due diligence within binding rules. So this could really change things. You've also got a policy of countries which are generally accepting recycled materials. So you have kind of anti-dumping policies, etc., because they don't want to ruin their local economic market for new textiles, etc. And so that's also something to bear in mind, I think. So Moving on, I suppose, to then what does the actual OECD due diligence guidance entail then for these different actors that I've just talked about? Companies really need to scope, as I said, where the risks are in the supply chain, including the downward chain, and what are the most significant risks, and take action to address those. This means also then prioritizing risks. So in the case that we've heard here, where there's child labour is an important risk, that would mean prioritizing child labour and working with partners to prevent, cease, mitigate that particular harm. Generally, that means exploring what that issue is in more detail. So doing reports, as we've seen here, doing surveys, having perhaps regular audits, which do play a role, even though they're not sufficient in and of themselves. And then, as we heard from Mary, the importance of actually having ongoing monitoring through engagement with trade unions, with workers themselves, to understand what's happening. And also to make sure you get feedback as a company on the actions that you're taking to prevent, cease, mitigate. Are they actually having effect? How can you find that out? Where you talk to the workers themselves, and you have processes in which to do that. Of course, this is not easy. It's not easy to identify where these where the different processes are taking place, particularly in a supply chain with lots of informality. So that's where really collaboration with different actors is very important. And also, I think there's a huge opportunity here for companies like Symphony to collaborate with the companies that are, as I said earlier, the upstream brands and retailers that are actually whose clothing they're sorting, and then the downstream users, the carpet companies, the mattresses, etc. Because everyone has a responsibility, and it would be much better if they kind of all work together on this ecosystem. So there's a lot of potential there. And then the final steps of due diligence are, of course, reporting and communicating. And that kind of transparency is only possible once you've done all the key work before that. But it's really important because it basically helps all the other actors know what the risks are and can support. So it can help create additional useful collaboration, but it also tells the wider community really where the risks are and what risks they're facing when they're looking at this particular part of the supply chain. So I think I'll pause there and hand back to the colleagues, but looking forward to further discussion.
Thank you, thank you, Dorothy, for this this comment or your sharing your perspective on how to introduce the due diligence guidance, and especially the garment guidance from 2017. I understand, so I think that you can contribute to the discussion. We had some questions already on the chat, and we will take them also in account in this discussion next half hour. If you want to put a question by telling us, please raise your hand, and then we can see if we can give you the word to argument and to give your question. We had 4 questions where we started with. So we considered that implementing a standard also implies addressing OECD guidelines. That's what we have seen also in the discussion, so that could be answered with yes. But the challenge that we have is a real big challenge, and if we do not succeed in implementing real SA 8000, especially in the Tier 2 and Tier 3 suppliers, could we also consider on focusing reporting the progress in this program? That's a question that's puzzling, and is the proposed approach that we have. We want to work, and I'm commenting also on a question that we got. We have a 3-year plan to work on this implementation of, say, social accountability. and we have 25 suppliers in tier 2 and tier 3 which signed a letter of intent, so they have the intention to work together with us on this. But is it sufficient to build a credible a label for us to produce also the yarn for the new garments? So, and then especially, and that's what I would also like to comment from Dorothy. I see you already raised your hand, so you can probably say something about the level playing field. What will OECD do with promoting? So it's good to promote to the countries, but how will they guarantee a kind of level playing field so that everybody is investing enough and up to the standard that we really want to achieve? And if Simply is the only one that's running, it will not help. So it will help to give a perspective to others, but at the end it will not help. We will do everything in our project to have true cost models, to make transparent what it really costs to social accountability and recycling work together. But we need some say backing up from you. But I see you raised your hand, so please can you comment on these questions?
Yes, thank you. I'd really like to, but I also don't want to dominate. So I'll just address from my side, and I'd like to hear from others as well. So just to say, I mean, we wouldn't say that implementing SA 8000 implies also addressing OECD guidelines. Now, I'll explain exactly what I mean. It's more nuanced than that maybe that sounds. Basically, OECD guidelines is like the whole supply chain approach. So it's about, you know, taking a company's responsibility to scope the full supply chain and then find where the risks are, and then take enhanced perhaps assessment processes or use certifications for those aspects of their supply chain where there is high risk and where they need to do additional due diligence. So SA 8000 as a standard, like many other standards, plus also other types of audits or assessment processes, has a role to play within a company's due diligence. But on its own, it's not sufficient. So, and what I mean by that is SA 8000 in the spinning mill might help address some of those issues at the spinning mill level, particularly if, as well as SA 8000, there's these other checks and balances and ongoing monitoring that Symphony or its you know, equivalent companies addressing these types of risks are doing, particularly engagement with local stakeholders to make sure that in fact like I said, the preventative action that maybe is being done on these particular risks are being addressed. So but then there may be also risks and other risks in Symphony's supply chain, and I'm just again using Symphony as an example here of equivalent companies at this point, such as, I don't know, like chemicals in the recycling sector that they need to look after, and that doesn't come under the SA 8000 standard. And so they will need to also address those in whichever way is most appropriate. And perhaps that's through other standards, through other programs, through other collaborative approaches. So just to be quite clear, you know, there's no one kind of silver bullet, unfortunately, for due diligence, and companies need to again prioritize and consider which certifications or just policy that they adopt and the way they implement that policy will actually make a difference. To clarify a bit further too, of course, it's important for a company like Symphony, and again, its competitors or sister and brother companies, to actually understand what a standard like SA 8000 is doing, and to make a really informed decision about which standards they adopt. And I know that's not easy, and the OECD recognizes that in this sector there's a plethora of different voluntary initiatives and standards that you know, basically adopt perhaps labor standards or environmental standards policies, and with those, they have certain policies, and then they also implement them in in the supply chain in whichever segment they're working. And what the OECD is trying to do is to actually do assessments of these different standards against the OECD guidelines. And because we know it's not easy for one company to understand whether or not an initiative that they're collaborating in, or a standard or a certification scheme that they're using is aligned. And so we're trying to help clarify that kind of landscape. And so we have an assessment process that we've done 3 and almost 4 assessments of due diligence initiatives in the sector. And this coming year, we're actually going to start doing some certification schemes as well, which is very exciting. So even though, unfortunately, the OECD's alignment work isn't kind of at the point and scaled up to the point where every single initiative out there can kind of go through this alignment assessment process. And it's something that our governments are very supportive of, and this year we'll be doing an assessment of, for example, the Green Button initiative, which is the German label, which is half due diligence and half kind of product certification. And this will be a very interesting study. So we look forward to kind of bringing the results to you all on that. So I hope that kind of clarified, and I think it's also relevant for your proposal for building a label as well. I think it's very important to make sure that the whatever label that you bring in, the written procedures and policies of the label are aligned with the OECD due diligence guidance. And then, of course, the way it's implemented is also following alignment. We're going to be helping you through that process, even if organizations can't immediately do an alignment assessment because of OECD's resource capacity to do these. But we're working also with the ITC to develop a kind of due diligence checker. And so hopefully later this year, it would be essentially a tool that companies and initiatives can use to kind of check through a few different questions to understand the extent to which their written procedures are aligned with the OECD guidance. It doesn't act as an endorsement, of course. It's not the OECD saying, yes, this organization is aligned or not aligned, but it will help, I think, if an organization is trying to develop their own label, to think through actually what are the questions I need to consider when I'm thinking about alignment.
Yes. Thank you, Dorothy, for the explanation. I think there is a question, and I have the question myself. You talk about this alignment assessment that you are going to make. Where can we find and when can we expect the standards that you are assessing? So if SA 8000 is in it, can you explain where we can find these answers or the reports? Yes,
I've just posted in the chat the link to our alignment assessment work. Within that, you'll find minerals assessments and garment assessments. So you could look on the garment assessments. So far, we've done assessments of the SAC, the German Partnership for Sustainable Textiles, and the Dutch agreement, which just ended at the end of 2021. And we're currently doing an assessment of Fair Wear Foundation. And this coming year, we'll be doing assessment of the Green Button, plus 2 other initiatives to be determined. And yes, over time, we're hoping to build this work. At the moment, we haven't assessed any certification schemes. So that's really to be done. And SA 8000 hasn't been assessed, for example. But there's a lot of potential there to build this work up.
Yeah. So if we compare the SA 8000 and the guidance for the garment sector, we see that there is an alignment in the criteria that are in it. So that was the second question we have. Could we also?
I would probably not say necessarily there's alignment between SA 8000 and the OECD due diligence guidance. I would say that SA 8000 is a standard that adopts the ILO conventions and it addresses the risks in the OECD guidance then it's basically a audit and certification scheme, which it gives you steps along the due diligence process. So it also includes regular monitoring, etc., etc. But until OECD has done an alignment assessment, we have to be quite careful about saying it is aligned or not, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, I understand. So for us, it could be best to start with OECD guidance and put our monitoring process of social conditions and social responsibility in place according to the OECD guidance.
Yes, and that can include organizations like SA 8000. It doesn't exclude them.
No.
I hope that's clear. It's like the OECD approach
sure.
is a bit broader.
Sure. But it could mean that organizations that would want to comply with SA 8000 would make the same steps. So it wouldn't change the plans a lot for these organizations. So thank you. I have another question in the box. Rakesh Vakazani asked, is it possible to participate and contribute with this assessment activity to non-OECD employees? So if we're thinking about non-OECD countries, would it be also be helpful? Because we think that India is not one of the 50 countries that has adopted, but has said that they accept the OECD guidelines. Could you help us out, Dorothy, again?
Sure. Yeah, I think maybe there's two different questions. So firstly, when it comes to India, it's true they're not an adherent to the OECD guidelines, but they recognize, I think there's strong recognition for countries that aren't part of the OECD guidelines, the OECD, that their key export markets are. And so there's a kind of trickle-down effect, if you like, of needing to understand the OECD guidance. And the OECD, we've had quite a good relationship with the Confederation of Indian Industry, for example, the last few years, to try and see ways where we can find compatibility in adopting approaches that draw from the OECD guidelines, the UN Guiding Principles in Business and Human Rights, etc. Perhaps another interesting development is not so much in the textile space, but in the minerals space. We're seeing a lot of market exchanges requiring alignment with the OECD minerals guidance in order to trade on their stock exchange, etc. We're seeing that from the London Metals Exchange, but also a couple of Indian exchanges have also adopted that in the last year. That in the minerals space and the gold space, there's quite a lot of interesting drivers from the market, even if it's not Indian government driven, if you see what I mean. I think Rakesh's question is about how to engage with the OECD alignment assessments themselves. Well, the assessment is basically between the OECD and the initiative being assessed. We also always adopt informal experts or informal advisory group of stakeholders representing different stakeholders who help keep the OECD in track when we're doing these assessments and make sure we don't miss things, etc. So normally that's quite a small group representing civil society, trade union, business, and government, ideally. But I would say in these assessments, there's not really a kind of way to everyone weigh in, but do take a look at our reports and do follow our work.
Dorothy, I think that we have also a follow-up question in the chat. Can you also read the chat and the question? Because they put also the question if non-employees of OECD can participate.
Yes, I think I just answered that question.
Oh, yeah.
So it's between the OECD as assessors and the initiative.
So that's possible. Okay. Thank you. And I come back to one earlier question to give you some more insight. So I explained that there was a question if we want to do also a training program according to the work we want to do. And as I explained, we have a plan for the next 3 years to implement social accountability or responsibility. But there also will be need for training. Probably, Helle, can you explain a little bit what what is the idea about how to get especially the tier 2 and 3 companies along in the project? You should unmute, Helle. We cannot hear you, Helle. Have your microphone on?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay. Yeah, it is of course a challenge. We have some employees, mobilizers. They go from factory to factory and get good relations with those that are leading the factories, and trying to work together with them to change different things in the factory that is not costing money, and also trying to change things that are costing money, where we then see how we can maybe help, for example, in constructing toilets, or in looking after smaller children, or in making a lunch area for the workers. So in one way or the other, we are trying to work with the factories to live up and to improve the standards. But I have to say it is a challenge, especially on the 3-layered factories that are very small and not have so much income, so much profit, that they can go in and make bigger interventions. It will of course help if they get better prices for their product. Then they can also give better salaries to the staff, and then they can also improve situations better for the workers. But I think that both in time and with the work that we are doing, things they will have to go in a better direction. And this is also what we have been trying to do together with the Symphony. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. That's clear. So you are more or less getting a good connection with the industry, with the smaller companies, and it's training on the job. But perhaps, Mary, you are into training programs especially. Do you think that real proper training in this, more getting awareness, would help in also in Panipat region? What is your experience with other regions?
I think since we have experimented the child labor free zone efforts in our locations, the same thing we can try in this Panipat area. I'm hoping that we can bring all the stakeholders into it, and then we are expecting that we can bring some changes slowly in that area.
Yes, so your opinion is, in other areas, training was very important to achieve and to get a standard implemented, right?
Yes, training. Training, instead of training, we can say sensitization.
Yes. So, and for the
sensitization of every stakeholders and coming together and to achieve the same goal.
Yes, sure. And for the one who asked the question, we will report as transparent as possible. So if we develop training programs and if we get our findings, we will report to them. And please send a message or send an email to us for the reports or the experience that we have, so that we can answer properly to your individual questions. So yes. Now let's go on with the discussion. Erika, you raised your hand earlier. Do you have a question?
Well, I was going to respond to Dorothy's contribution about OECD guidelines and the due diligence, and how this relates to SA 8000 and what to do with the smaller facilities like Tier 2, Tier 3. From her contribution, I feel that that is best addressed when doing a kind of a full risk assessment of the complete supply chain. So not focus on individual facilities, but from a more broader risk management approach, and see which risks are most severe and which should be addressed first. And that could well be at a Tier 2, Tier 3 facility, but it could also be something completely different. So that's what I've learned from Dorothy's contribution.
Okay, so we get more focus in what we want, what we have planned in the next 3 years to do. That's nice. So that's nice contribution. Is there anybody who wants to put a question in this discussion, or has experience that he wants to share with us?
Well, I see some comments actually in the chat box, which relates very much to the integrating or how to establish community engagement and integrate the workers' voice. So this is maybe something for Helle or Mary to contribute, but Helle already raised her hand, so maybe she can already contribute to this.
Yeah, I very much agree in what Mary said earlier, that making a child labor-free zone, it is very, very good. We have done that in Panipat together with Symphony, and it really helps to come to know the factories and the workers, and get them to open up also about the challenges and how the challenges can be solved. And also to have one-to-one discussions with them to make sure that they understand that education for their children, it is important, and that child labor is not an option for a good life in the future, but that going to school is the way forward. So I would say that interacting with the community is really, really important.
Yes, thank you, Helle. So that's in our program. The specialty in our program is that we always say they have to do schooling, because then we are sure that they are not working, right? That's the idea. So you can improve wages and raise them up to standard, but then you're still not sure that you have no child labor. But if you have the children in the schooling, then you have more, say, continuously guarantee that you have no child labor, and that there is a perspective for all the children also from these workers, right? And we have companies who are willing to contribute to that, so that's fine for the next year. So that's a good perspective. Anybody else who wants to have a question? Somebody who wants to comment on the challenges that we have? Is there anybody out who's also wanting to introduce a label, especially a label to make for consumers clear what is happening in the chain, in the real circular chain? So we want to introduce our yarn into new garments. Is there anybody who has experience with it and faced the same kind of problems? No, I see nothing from the chat. Dorothy, you raised your hand. You want to comment, please?
Yeah, thank you. I'd just like to follow up on my question to Mary in the chat, and I think it brings back to this point about alignment as well. So the OECD guidance really requires that in assessing conditions at a site level, that of course audits can play a role, but it's really important that those audits integrate worker perspectives and community engagement, because sometimes an audit, for example, an audit might not uncover a particular risk because we know certain risks are actually very hidden, whereas community engagement might tell you that, for example, sexual harassment is really prevalent in the region, and because we know it's a hidden risk, then you can actually tailor your assessment, whether it's SA 8000, whether it's SEDEX, whether it's Amphori BSCI, to actually look into and use additional tools to kind of explore that particular risk. So this is just one example of why this is so important for the due diligence guidance. And I think it would be great to hear from Mary a bit more on how she sees companies doing good engagement with stakeholders through their due diligence process, including where, you know, they're also using certain assessment approaches.
Mary, could you give some idea about how you get this community interaction and explain how hidden risks are revealed in your situations?
I think Dorothy put it up in a very well mannered. Until the community engagement with the relevant factory surroundings, we cannot address the issues, because the entire surroundings having, for example, already Dorothy also mentioned, they wanted to engage the children in the workplaces, or the harassment is highly prevalent in the community. The people, those who are being inside, will be going away from this kind of attitude. The same thing will reflect inside the factory. See, if for example, in the community, the patriarchy system is strongly placed, the same people, those who are living in the surroundings, when they are getting inside the factory, will they come out of it? The same reflection will be there inside also. The patriarchy system will play. Even if it comes to a supervisor position or any authority position is there, still it is worse. So the community engagement is equally important when you're doing whatever the due diligence process, you are adapting it. For having only knowledge with the community will never work it out. Some will say yes or no, this kind will not work it out. But the surroundings, what kind of practices already existing? The same practices, I mean, have to be handled inside the factory. Otherwise, we cannot uproot anything, or we cannot move further one step ahead. So community engagement is very, very important in all the due diligence process, whatever the method they are adopting it. This is what my humble suggestions.
Yes, so thank you. So you also you say an audit in the factory is not enough. You have to have an idea about what's happening in the community, because what in the day that the audit takes place, it could be a sunny day and everything is okay, and one day the other day it still happens what happens in the community, and it also happens in the factories again, right? So that's clear to me, and that would also give more idea for OECD guidance and a deeper due diligence process according to set aside by certification. Okay. Thank you very much. I think we are ending the time, 10:15. So is then the next question. Is somebody raising hands at the moment?
Well, Gemma took back the question that was raised earlier about the role of the local government, and if there is any possibility there to have them involved more yeah, dominantly, or yeah, Helen may.
Helle may comment. She had good contacts with local government there.
Yes. See, we work very closely with school development committee, with local authorities, with child labor department, and so on. This is really, really important. And apart from that, we have in Panipat, we have established what we call a child right protection forum. And that is approximately 80 people up to now. And they are coming from all kinds of levels of the community. They are former teachers, they are business people. They are coming together because they also feel that there should be no child labor and all children should go to school. And they are also helping us to go to the local leaders if we find some situations where there is abuse of children, if there is factories that are actually having child labor and they are not listening. They are going together with us to the local communities. We have very good communication with police and so on, so that we need to come together to solve the situation. It is not a one-man show. It is something that is for all of us to come together and do something about. Thank you.
Yes, adding to Helen, I think the government system already, whatever she has mentioned, Child Welfare Committee, District Child Protection Unit, the Child Helpline number, toll-free number 1098. So this kind of system already the government has built it up to remediate these kind of things, and including the Labor Department. Inspectorate of Labor is there to rescue and rehabilitate the any child worker in the factory. They also will play a major role in it, rescuing and rehabilitating measures. So these are all the important body. It must include even in the due diligence process, particularly to address the child labor. It would be good, I feel.
Okay, thank you. I think we have had an interesting discussion. I want to thank you all on behalf of the organizers and for your attendance and for your questions and for your participation in the discussion. It will help us a lot to get along the next years in the project. And we hope we have also inspired you a little bit to do the same kind of things and to work on due diligence, especially in your sectors or in other sectors. And if you have still questions, please email to us and we will reply back to you. And we hope to meet you again sometime next year or next year behalf with our results for the project. Thank you very much. And say all bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.